You are listening to Medicine and the Machine with Medscape Editor-in-Chief Eric Topol and Master Storyteller and Clinician Abraham Verghese as they talk with experts around the globe about the hottest topics in healthcare. This podcast is intended for U.S. healthcare professionals only.
Welcome to another episode of Medicine and the Machine with my wonderful co-host, Eric Topol. We're trying to do today something that we have done before, which is pause and take a look back at where we are with COVID, which really seems to have emerged as the dominant conversation piece for our podcast. And I can't think of anyone in the world who is more up to date on matters to do with COVID than Eric. And I'm not alone. I think literally millions of us are following him. Is it millions, Eric? It must be millions.
No, not at all. You're too kind. You're a great.
But anyway, I just wanted to, I think this is an interesting inflection point, Eric, where all around us in the UK and South Korea and Hong Kong, it seems that they're battling BA2, and we are either extremely lucky or on the threshold of something disastrous. And I just wanted to get your sense of what's going on and where we are the last few months.
Yeah, it's a really daunting situation to interpret. As you say, Abraham, many countries in Europe, more than a dozen, have gone through a very severe BA2 surge, still going on in the UK, and starting to tail off in many of those places. What's interesting is there were also countries in Europe like Sweden, or in Asia like India and Bangladesh, who had BA2 completely dominant. You didn't see a thing happen. South Africa too, they went through BA2 after having that initial Omicron November major surge, and they did extremely well with minimal increase. So BA2, we know it's 30% more contagious than the BA1 Omicron. Also in the US, we had a lot of the BA1.1, which is just one mutation different, nothing like multiple mutations like the BA2. And as you said, in China, it's BA2, and in many countries in Asia as well. And they're going through, or have gone through, like South Korea, one of the best managed countries in the world. They have had to deal with unchecked spread, and at one point and still today, they're the number one per capita new cases in the world. They do test aggressively, and that's one of the things that makes it difficult to interpret in the US is we have so much home testing that doesn't get recorded centrally. So it's trickier to follow. We're using wastewater, we're using hospitalizations that are mixed with COVID and not COVID, and I mean it's part of the problem we have in learning what's going on here is while it looks relatively favorable, we don't have our arms around all the data we need.
Does any of this correlate with vaccination status or with immunity from natural infection, country by country?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question too, because the vaccines aren't holding up well at all with these Omicron variants for infection. And the booster has turned out to be just essential to prevent severe disease with hospitalizations and ICUs and deaths. So when you're looking at cases, that's another thing that you can be misled, because if you look at these countries in Europe that were so severely affected, most of them were able to suppress the severe disease. And in the UK right now, it's at peak hospitalizations for the pandemic, but almost 66% or more are not COVID indexed. They're with, not for COVID. So, these are issues because it's just so darn infectious. And the vaccines, it's kind of blowing right through vaccines for that reason, including, people who've had 3 shots, but that 3rd shot, and now, of course, we're talking about a 4th shot. It's really only vital for the progression of the disease, not for the initial infection or transmission. I mean, it does kick in initially for infection protection, but it's like 50% and then drops off so quickly.
I think that's a distinction that I know medical students struggle with tuberculosis, for example, the distinction between someone being infected and therefore having a positive PPD versus being diseased. And so I guess what you're saying is it does not prevent us from acquiring the infection, but it does seem to continue to protect us from severe hospitalization.
Yeah, and I think that's the unfortunate thing is, the goalposts changed. Initially, when the vaccines rolled out, we had 95% efficacy against symptomatic infections. Now and against severe disease. Now we're trying to eke out that 95% just against hospitalizations and deaths. And we get that from a third or fourth shot, at least for some weeks, even up to 4 months or so. But yeah, we basically can't keep up with this virus that's evolving. And Omicron, both the initial BA1 and then now this more recent BA2, have really thrown us big challenges. I mean, more than 50 mutations from the original strain, really challenging our immune system, taking it to the max. We can't really afford another variant that's even more evasive of our immune system, because it's going to take a big toll on our ability to prevent our vaccines that are not, they're outdated essentially.
You and I were both surprised by the FDA reporting that some 50% of, or at an FDA meeting, they report that 50% of our population has been infected. Talk about that a bit, if you would.
Yeah, that's a massive number within 10 weeks to have half Americans. We're talking about 160 some million Americans getting Omicron, whether they knew it or not. And those are the projections from one of our top data scientists, Trevor Bradford from University of Washington. He's been kind of spot on for the whole pandemic. He presented that at the FDA yesterday. And that's in 10 weeks. So that brings up, Abraham, that you were getting at, is if the US does hold up well and better than expected in this current wave, there is a wave. The question is it going to be, a big spike? If we don't see what's going on in the UK and other places, it may be because we just took such a big brunt of the Omicron from the first wave. We got to the highest level of hospitalizations ever in the pandemic, 160,000. We were getting cases the ones that were confirmed at levels that were just, completely off the charts, unimaginable. So, that there is cross immunity. It isn't perfect. There have been some people who had Omicron and then got BA2, but they seem to be pretty unusual or uncommon at least. So that may be the leading explanation for if we stay somewhat unscathed.
Paradoxically, the rapid antigen tests, even though they're tremendous, I think have led people to completely abandon PCR, and the threshold for rapid antigen tests is so high that I think we're lulled into a sense of nobody has this, when in fact everybody might have it, and we just didn't know.
Right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Not only the rapid antigen test will miss some infections, but their threshold for being positive means you have to have quite a bit of viral load. And so, the abandonment of the conventional PCR testing and then the inability for us to see that is tricky. One thing, though, I'd say is that we were using a lot of rapid tests since the beginning of Omicron. I don't know that it's changed that much in this current second wave with the BA2. So I think trying to compare the over this time since December, there's a lot of rapid tests, no question. They're difficult to interpret, but I'm not sure that it's going to change our sense of how testing in cases that much. Yeah.
So God forbid we experience what the UK is experiencing, but let's say that we do. What's changed in terms of therapy? What's changed in terms of our approach to symptomatic outpatients and inpatients who are obviously more sick?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, of course, is having wide availability of Paxlovid pills, that 5-day pack, combined pills. That if we had that broadly available, that's a security blanket, because for anyone at increased risk, as soon as they had an infection, could take the 5-day and have a 90% reduction of hospitalizations and deaths. But we don't have a big supply. The ability to purchase what the orders were put in for 20 million blister packs. And it turns out we only have 800 some thousand, because the government hasn't approved the added COVID relief package. So at the moment it's in suspension, which is amazing. So there's this order to get the pills, and it can't be fulfilled until it's paid. So that's one issue. The other thing is, if we ever do get enough Paxlovid, which is questionable, there will probably be some resistance emerge over time when it's in wide use. And we don't really have a good backup pill for outpatient use. We need that. And there's a few candidates in the hopper, but they're pretty far away in time. And so it really gets to, the debate at the FDA yesterday by the advisors was, we can't live with a 4-month booster schedule. No one wants to do that, which is kind of all we get now, if that much, for the protection enhanced from the boosters. So one way to circumvent this problem, of course, would be much better pills. I say drugs, but the monoclonal antibodies are not holding up either. And there really aren't any other great preventative drugs available. And as you know, at least if you get sick, there's a lot of things that can be done to help reduce that massive cytokine storm, to try to keep people from getting too critically ill. And one thing that's really notable, Abraham, I'm struck by, we're down to less than 2,000 people in the ICU in the country right now, which is the lowest by far of any time in the pandemic. And what that tells me is that we've gotten so much better, in terms of, people are vaccinated. And when they do get admitted, we have a lot of tools that we didn't have before. So, hopefully we can avoid the most critical hospitalizations and deaths much better. I think the biggest problem is, as you well know, we don't have we have less than 30% of Americans boosted, and we have tens of millions of people who have never had a vaccine dose, which is amazing. I mean, I'm not talking about 0 to 5-year-olds. I'm talking about adults. So we're vulnerable.
Yeah. It's a good thing that 50% have been exposed to Omicron. I mean, I suppose that's a blessing in disguise. I must ask about the monoclonal antibodies. So let's say you do get admitted to the hospital and you are ill enough. Which monoclonals are holding up, in your opinion?
Yeah, this is actually really interesting. This is the first time that I can remember in medicine where if you could sequence the patient's virus, it would tell you which treatment to give. But we don't have that capability. We should, but we don't. Nobody gets their actual sequence back. But with BA1, the Glaxo antibody sotrovimab worked pretty well, but it doesn't work with BA2. And so we're down to, just a couple of antibodies that seem to have efficacy and still not exactly proven with BA2. But, for a while, we had a whole bunch of antibodies to select from. And as the virus has evolved, it's becoming more narrow a choice and limited supply. And as we already mentioned, the issues about not having enough funds to acquire the doses.
Yeah. One of the things I've really enjoyed about your tweets is keeping us abreast of all the amazing science that's going on. So if you had to look back for the last couple of months, maybe 6 months here, what have been the biggest breakthroughs on the genetics and other science front as it relates to this virus and our defenses?
Yeah, there's been so much. I think we've learned a lot about the genetics of people that gives them either protection or vulnerability with either common or rare variants. It isn't of practical interest because you can't really use that to help segment risk, but we know that, you could all be together in a room with an infectious person, and certain people are just totally resistant, and others highly vulnerable. I think we're understanding that better now, but that doesn't really change things too much. I think the biggest cluster of papers, which have been so remarkable, have been the long COVID status at 1 year. I'd say the three biggest ones were first the cardiovascular, from the Veterans Affairs of hundreds of thousands of people with millions of controls, the amount of people who had late issues with heart failure and stroke and arrhythmias. I mean, really striking and confirmed by other studies. Then, the brain, that UK Biobank brain scan study to me was one of the most important of all, showing how there was loss of gray matter, atrophy of the brain, cognitive decline in people with mild to moderate infections because they had a baseline MRI before they even got COVID compared with controls. Very concerning. And then the other one in the long COVID category, which I'm struck by, I don't know what you think, there's studies that have come out multiple where late diabetes is emerging, not present in the initial 30 days, but present at 1 year or 6 months, 20 to 40% of type 2 diabetes with controls that didn't, without COVID. That to me, where did that come from, right?
That's staggering.
Yeah. Really? Now, even if the number turns out to be, single digits or, 15%, which, they're all between 20 and 40 right now. It's still, just think about how many people have had COVID and then manifest late type 2 diabetes. I don't know. I mean, that one, now again, these long COVID papers, they're of great interest, but we still have no treatment, nothing to prevent this. I mean, nothing to treat it, just the prevention that a lot of people don't respect enough the importance of avoiding the infections so we can avoid long COVID.
And the symptoms of long COVID are so non-specific and just the kind of thing that, can be easily dismissed by both patient and the healthcare system. In the UK right now, they don't even have PCR testing, so they have no way of even establishing, who's got what. So yeah, it's truly a challenge. Well, it's been great to catch up. I think the bottom line is we should really work hard to stay from acquiring this virus, to do everything we can to protect ourselves, vaccine, and when the levels rise, I guess masks too would be critical. What is your personal practice now when you're out and about and when you travel?
Yeah. I'm still wearing masks when I go to the grocery store and, where, there are a lot of people and I don't know what their status is. I'll go, when we're having a conference room gathering with people I know, I'm not worried about wearing a mask. And also, fortunately, we've got really good filtration and, state-of-the-art type, at least prevention there. But no, I still try my guard up. Being an old dog, doesn't matter how many boosters you have. I think this is really, we have a ways to go to get through this. We may well see in the months ahead a more challenging variant than we've already seen. And that's why, I think still keeping the guard up is essential. I hope we'll get to a much better vaccine going forward, which does take on all the variants. It's doable. I'm convinced of that. And, going back to the science papers, there's been more than 20 different candidates for universal pan beta coronavirus vaccine. And so if we could just jump on that and really go, into high gear, maybe we could get one that was ready in the months ahead or, certainly within a year from now. So, this has been a long hyper marathon, right? I mean, I'm just amazing, but I think it's hard for people. I know for my family and I to stay on guard, not to just let down and just try to forget about it. It's in the background.
It's interesting, Eric, when we started this podcast, we had no sense of what was coming, and COVID being on the horizon, and how much it has sort of colored our lives. But it certainly has made for wonderful discussions, and I've learned a lot, and it's been a pleasure to host this with you. I guess the message for our listeners is be careful out there and stay informed, and protect yourselves and your families.
Yeah, I think that's really it. And I think there's a lot of vulnerability still, and we don't want this virus to beat us, as it already in so many ways has. And we know how we can deal with it. It's challenging, but if we get through in the U.S. at least a relatively low burden in this BA2 wave, that's great, and we may wind up having several good months ahead, and maybe even years. That would be wonderful. So hopefully, it's possible the worst is behind us. That would be wonderful. But I guess most days I'm in a higher level of concern that that's not likely. We'll see. But no, it's just a joy to have these conversations with each other and with our guests. I mean, we've had probably 40, 50, I don't know how many people, experts.
Amazing. Yeah.
Interview and learn from. I mean, and that's actually one of my great defenses of dealing with the pandemic, is just getting the stimulation from these conversations and reading papers and trying to keep up, because that's one way to kind of not get too depressed, because there is a lot of great advances on the science side, and that is actually it's thrilling to see that.
Yeah, it's good to focus on that. Well, to all our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of Medicine and the Machine, and we hope you'll continue to join us for interesting guests and stimulating conversation. And special thanks to my co-host Eric for everything he does, and look forward to our next episode.